Friedrich Nietzsche is one of the most important modern philosophers. He has a lot of cultural influence, and he also went on to influence existentialism with Kierkegaard. He has a certain particularity about him that makes him particularly enjoyable to read. He's very vigorous with everything that he says, and very passionate. His prose is also very unique in that it's really not comparable to anyone in the modern era. In terms of philosophers, he's quite a bit of a outlier in the sense that his doctrines are quite direct and quite naturalistic, even usually, and he has a very particular brand of nihilism that has become very famous. So we're going to take a look through some of his works. I have here his Thus Spoke Zarathustra, The Gay Science, and Human All Too Human, which I think are some of the best texts for looking at Nietzsche. Thus Spoke Zarathustra is where I'd like to start, simply because it provides us a good underpinning for his attitude towards thinking in general and towards life. Nietzsche is one of the most important philosophers because he's a very ardently atheistic philosopher. He is famous for proclaiming the death of God. He does that many times throughout his works, first in The Gay Science and then in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. He does it near the beginning of the book. And we're just going to kind of take some selections through these books and analyze exactly what he was getting at. Now, for the beginning of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, it's important to realize another work that Nietzsche wrote called The Antichrist. And Nietzsche was so atheistic that he was very adamant about him being the Antichrist. Not, of course, in the sense that he adhered to the Christian theology, but rather that he saw himself as the pushing past of Christianity. He thought he was the final death blow to this religion, and he thought that we should not be preaching about death, which is what he often claims that religious people are, as preachers of death. He claims that we should become Übermensch, and that we should, basically become supermen, these kind of people who are above that. Not in the sense that they are morally above that, because one of Nietzsche's biggest criticisms is of morality, and we'll see that in a moment. But he wants to preach of this world. He wants to have us focus on the things that are here in front of us. And in this sense, he has a lot of existentialist tendencies. So Nietzsche, when writing Thus Spoke Zarathustra, has a very Christian mentality when going through it. You'll see a lot of imagery and a lot of allusions to Christian sort of ideas. And Nietzsche kind of wants to tear us away from that and basically say, well, these don't necessarily need to be Christian ideas. But he also wants to play on the influence to show maybe some of the shortcomings of doctrine. In the prologue to Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche writes, "When Zarathustra was 30 years old, he left his home and the lake of his home and went into the mountains. There he enjoyed his spirit and solitude, and for 10 years did not weary of it. But at last his heart longed, and rising one morning with the dawn, he stood before the sun and spoke to it thus: 'You great star, what would your happiness be if you had not those for whom you shine? For 10 years you have climbed here to my cave. You would have wearied of your light and of this journey, without me, my eagle and my serpent. But we awaited you every morning, took from you your overflow, and blessed you for it. Behold, I am weary of my wisdom, like the bee that has gathered too much honey. I need hands outstretched to take it. I want to give away and distribute. until the wise have once more become happy in their folly, and the poor happy in their riches. Therefore I must descend into the depths, as you do in the evening when you go behind the sea, and bring light also to the underworld, you exuberant star. Like you, I must go under, as men say, to whom I shall descend. Bless me then, you tranquil eye, that can behold even an all too great happiness without envy. Bless the cup that wants to overflow, that the waters may flow golden from him, and carry everywhere the reflection of your joy. Behold, this cup wants to empty again, and Zarathustra wants to be man again. Thus Zarathustra began to go under. Zarathustra here kind of paints this preacher of a message kind of picture in which he has this knowledge and he wants to, go under, which seems like it would carry some connotations of like he's going to the lesser peoples. And there's definitely some implications like that throughout Nietzsche's philosophy. Nietzsche was famous for being adopted by the Nazis, and there's a big argument about whether or not Nazi tendencies are within his writing. He certainly adheres to some social Darwinist kind of thinking. For example, he thinks all human action is directed towards the continuation of the species, and that those who rise higher simply have the power to do so, and they should embrace their personal power and freedom. So in that sense, you could maybe argue so, but he's also very ardently anti-Semitic. In his Human All Too Human, he basically praises the Jewish people for creating some of the most important literary works. He praises people like Spinoza, and he also adamantly opposes anti-Semites, basically saying that the Jewish people are the most persecuted people. So I think that's a bit of a silly argument. But we see that in the beginning of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he's very clearly showing a love for the earth, and this is a tendency that he shows throughout. He shows his love for the sun and for the way that it is just going about its cyclical nature and doesn't get tired, and he thinks this is great. In this sense, he may have some sort of stoic tendencies, but Nietzsche would be very quick to reject something like that. He did not like the Greeks. He thought that they shared similar tendencies to the Christians that he was not for. But I would like to get into the next part of the prologue, which is relatively short. It's just a little bit longer than the previous one, where he exclaims the death of God. And of course, we will go into a little bit more depth on this because this is very important. Because of course, the idea that tri-omni God, omnipotent and all that, can die is nonsensical. And of course, that's not what Nietzsche is trying to say. He's not making a metaphysical claim. Otherwise, we would think he's quite stupid. And he elaborates in The Gay Science exactly what he means. So we'll get into that in a moment. Zarathustra went down the mountain alone and met no one. But when he entered the forest, there suddenly stood before him an old man, who had left his holy hut to look for roots. And the old man spoke thus to Zarathustra: "This wanderer is no stranger to me. He passed by here many years ago. He was called Zarathustra, but he has changed. Then you carry your ashes into the mountains. Would you now carry your fire into the valleys? Do you not fear the punishment for arsonists? Yes, I recognize Zarathustra. His eye is pure, and no loathing lurks about his mouth. Does he not walk like a dancer? Zarathustra is changed. Zarathustra has become like a child. Zarathustra is an awakened one. What do you want now in the land of the sleepers? You lived in your solitude in the sea, and it has borne you up. Alas, would you now climb ashore? Alas, would you again drag your own body?" Zarathustra answered, "I love mankind." "Why?" said the saint. "Did I go into the forest and the desert? Was it not because I loved men far too well? Now I love God. Men I do not love. Man is for me too imperfect a thing. Love of man would kill me. Zarathustra answered, Did I speak of love? I bring men a gift. Give them nothing, said the saint. Take rather part of their load and carry it along with them. That will be most agreeable to them, if only it agrees with you. And if you want to give them no more than alms, and let them beg for that. No, replied Zarathustra, I give no alms. I am not poor enough for that. The saint laughed at Zarathustra and spoke thus, Then see to it that they accept your treasures. They are distrustful of hermits, and do not believe that we come with gifts. Our footsteps ring too lonely through their streets, and just as at night, when they are in bed and hear a man abroad long before sunrise, so they ask themselves concerning us, Where is the thief going? Do not go to men, but stay in the forest. Go rather even to the animals. Why not be like me, a bear among bears, a bird among birds? And what is the saint doing in the forest? Asked Zarathustra. The saint answered, I make songs and sing them, and in making hymns I laugh and weep and hum. Thus I praise God. With singing, weeping, laughing, and humming, I praise the God who is my God. But what do you bring us as a gift? When Zarathustra had heard these words, he bowed to the saint and said, What could I have to give you? Let me rather hurry away, lest I take something from you. And thus he parted from one another, the old one and the man, laughing, just like two schoolboys laugh. But when Zarathustra was alone, he spoke thus to his heart. Could it then be possible? This old saint in his forest has not yet heard of it, that God is dead. So here we see the attitude with which Zarathustra, which is of course a proxy for Nietzsche, kind of feels about religion. When the hermit tells him that he should bring the people alms, he says, I give no alms, I'm not poor enough for that. You know, of course, implying that this is sort of a wretched act that we should be very displeased about. And it's kind of interesting because if you had just heard about Nietzsche and about his atheism, you might think he's just very ardently mean, and, you know, he's that mean atheist stereotype. But, you know, in fact, he wishes to leave the religious man alone, and he simply, you know, anything that I could do would simply take away from your happiness. So, lest I do that, I'll get on my way. And of course, in the company of just himself, he's like, how has he not realized yet that God is dead? And I think it's important that we delve into exactly what the death of God means in its particularity. In aphorism 125 of the Gay Science, titled The Madman, he details exactly what the death of God is by using a narrative example. He says, Have you not heard of that madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning hours, ran to the marketplace, and cried incessantly, I seek God, I seek God. As many of those who did not believe in God were standing around just then, he provoked much laughter. Has he got lost? Asked one. Did he lose his way like a child? Asked another. Or is he hiding? Is he afraid of us? Has he gone on a voyage? Emigrated? Thus they yelled and laughed. The madman jumped into their midst and pierced with them his eyes. Whither is God? He cried. I will tell you. We have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers. But how did we do this? How could we drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving? Away from all suns? Are we not plunging continually, backward, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there still any up or down? Are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? Do we not breathe the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is not night continually closing in on us? Do we not need to light lanterns in the morning? Do we hear nothing as yet of the noise of the grave diggers who are burying God? Do we smell nothing as yet of the divine decomposition? Gods, too, decompose. God is dead. God remains dead and we have killed him. So, of course, Nietzsche here is being a bit abstract with his thinking, and oftentimes you must go into his writings realizing that many of them are largely metaphorical. Sometimes he's very literal with you, especially in Human All Too Human, which he said is one of his more personal works. He's very direct with what he's trying to say. But in some of these aphoristic works, like The Gay Science, where he's writing these brief aphorisms, they're either very direct or quite obscure. And what Nietzsche is trying to pose here is not the death of God, but rather the death of the substrate by which we may represent him as existing, metaphysics. Nietzsche is saying that these sort of metaphysical understandings of the universe that give us our sense of direction, that he speaks of being gone, um, metaphysics no longer serves us very well. And of course, this is a bit of a controversial statement. I wouldn't go quite as far as Nietzsche, maybe, as saying that metaphysics are completely dead, because there's some similarities between metaphysics and ontology. They might even be called synonyms, and I think ontology is very much an alive subject, at least for me personally. But he mentions the fact that these sort of metaphysical understandings of the universe, like God, are dead, and that we have killed them, either through scientific processes or through the kind of philosophizing that we do. He's not quite as specific as we would like, but it's clear that society as a whole has passed its golden age of metaphysics and has, beaten it with a hammer, so to speak. And he's not necessarily happy about this. Sometimes he seems to be quite ecstatic about preaching about the earth, but oftentimes, as in this aphorism, he speaks of it making us lose our sense of direction and making it difficult to orient oneself. He says, "Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is not night continually closing in on us?" And here we're kind of getting an idea for those existentialist moods that he's very keen on presenting, which will later be expanded upon by people like Sartre and Camus and other existentialists. And he basically, in his later philosophy, he's going to try to show that metaphysics is beyond us. We have to live for this specific time right now, and that we have to live for the earth rather than for some sort of metaphysical transcendent beyond. Now, another important critique that Nietzsche has, and this is one of the important parts about Nietzsche, is that really he's a critical philosopher. Michael Sugru said that he is an expert at crafting little darts or something like that. And I think that's a wonderful way of putting it. He can have these very short aphorisms that are maybe a line or two, that are just penetrating and that you just have to really ruminate on for a moment. And an important thing that kind of coincides with the death of metaphysics is the death of ethics. If we have not this metaphysical foundation whereby which we might be given a moral imperative, say from God or from some other transcendent reality, he is very keen on making a genealogy of morals, which of course is a title of an entire book that he wrote. But in Human All Too Human, he gives us a nice little feeling of what he calls the fable of intelligible freedom. And this feels very similar to Hume when he, is very critical of society for trying to convince us that we have free will. And Nietzsche is very clearly a very deterministic thinker, thinks we do not have a freedom of the will. And not only that, But he thinks that as a whole, these sort of ideas of freedom and morality um, are just constructs that we've invented, and in fact they may have been evolutionarily created, because right around the time Nietzsche was writing, Darwin's theory of evolution was becoming very popular, and it was a death blow to much of Western thought as a whole. He writes in aphorism 39, "The history of those feelings by virtue of which we consider a person responsible, the so-called moral feelings, is divided into the following main phases. At first, we call particular acts good or evil without any consideration of their motives, but simply on the basis of their beneficial or harmful consequences. Soon, however, we forget the origin of these terms and imagine that the quality good or evil is inherent in the actions themselves, without consideration of their consequences. This is the same error language makes when calling the stone itself hard, the tree itself green. That is, we take the effect to be the cause. Then we assign the goodness or evil to the motives, and regard the acts themselves as morally ambiguous. We go even further and cease to give to the particular motive the predicate good or evil, but give it rather to the whole nature of a man. The motive grows out of him as a plant grows out of the earth. So we make man responsible, in turn, for the effects of his actions, then for his actions, then for his motives, and finally for his nature. Ultimately, we discover that his nature cannot be responsible either, in that it is in itself an inevitable consequence, an outgrowth of the elements and influences of past and present things. That is, man cannot be made responsible for anything, neither for his nature, nor his motives, nor his actions, nor the effects of his actions. And thus we come to understand that the history of moral feelings is the history of an error called responsibility, which in turn rests on an error called freedom of the will. And of course, this is a very deterministic way of approaching the idea of the freedom of the will. And he points out that we seem to dig these ideas deeper and deeper over time, solely based originally on their utility towards the species. So this would rightly be called a utilitarian evolutionary approach to morality, and he's very famous for this sort of thinking. Now, we already kind of spoke about the way that Nietzsche treats religion, but I think it's important that we delve a little bit more into exactly what his quips were with religion. In aphorism 226 of Human All Too Human, titled Origin of Faith, he states, "The bound spirit assumes a position not for reasons but out of habit. He is a Christian, for example, not because he had insight into the various religions and chose among them. He is an Englishman not because he decided for England, but rather Christianity and England were givens and he accepted them without having reasons, as someone who is born in wine country becomes a wine drinker. Later, when he was a Christian and an Englishman, he may also have devised some reasons in favor of his habit. Even if these reasons are overthrown, he, in his whole position, is not. Ask a bound spirit for his reasons against bigamy, for example, and you will learn whether his holy zeal for monogamy is based on reasons or on habit. The habit of intellectual principles without reason is called faith." So here we have a critique of faith, which of course is a very integral thing in Christianity and Judaism and Islam. And he basically says that, of course, this is without grounds. This is just the habit of intellectual principles without reasons. And this can be considered a bit of an oversimplification of religion, because it assumes that all people approach religion having been brought up into it as a sort of habit, and then they form their worldview around that habit, and as such, they create certain evidences that they think might bolster their belief. But of course, he's key to point out he may also have devised some reasons in favor of his habit. Even if these reasons are overthrown, he in his whole position is not. And this can often be seen in many cases where a particularly antiquated religious idea, maybe say Noah's flood, is bolstered as being historically accurate. And then we have archaeological data and things like that, among others, that would seem to implicate that it could not have happened. But of course, Nietzsche kind of points out that if you grow up into a thing as a habit, you don't actually come to reasons from the get-go. You approach it as a habit first, and you build reason on top of that habit, and that ultimately the habit is the base level of your belief, and that your belief is founded on that habit, that faith. It has nothing to do with the evidence. The evidence is just a superfluous icing on top of the cake. Now, of course, this is an oversimplification, because there are plenty of religious people who come to religion having not been brought up into it and things like that. And there are definitely some people who come to religion solely for intellectual reasons, but I think those would probably be few and far between compared to those who simply grow into it. You see, for example, in American culture, Christianity is part of our culture, and it's very easy to grow up into it and be a Christian without having read a substantial part of the Bible, maybe without even understanding the pillars of faith very well, or the tenets of faith, and just kind of going off of faith, kind of paradoxically. So Nietzsche is, of course, oversimplifying. Whether or not he knew this or not, we can't really be sure, but he definitely has a problem with faith as a Christian idea. Now, another important idea he has is the will to power. This is a very important idea because we definitely still see remnants of this idea in today's culture. Nietzsche saw power as kind of the revolving door through which history operated, and that power structured human affairs. And of course, someone like Foucault would take this to the absolute extreme, basically saying that different episteme are built on power. In aphorism 252 in Human All Too Human, which is titled Pleasure in Knowing, he kind of hints at this idea that knowledge is power, which is a very well-known phrase today. Why is knowledge the element of researchers and philosophers linked to pleasure? First and foremost, because by it we gain awareness of our power. The same reason that gymnastic exercises are pleasurable even without spectators. Second, because as we gain knowledge, we surpass older ideas and their representatives, become victors, or at least believe ourselves to be. Third, because any new knowledge, however small, makes us feel superior to everyone and unique in understanding this matter correctly. These three reasons for pleasure are the most important, but depending on the nature of the knower, there are still many secondary reasons. And of course, this aphorism does go on, but we'll stop there for exactly what we are concerned with. Here we kind of see a critique of the typical philosophical knowledge gaining. Nietzsche would criticize someone like Socrates, for example, for simply using their knowledge as a proxy for their will to power, for the fact that they wish to achieve dominance over other people, which is kind of the third point, is that because knowledge makes us feel superior and unique to everyone in understanding this matter correctly. This idea is relatively self-explanatory, and even today, power relations is an important way of looking at society, and Nietzsche was very keen on the sort of Saltean understanding of human relations. For example, Salte, existentialist, in his play No Exit, he sets the stage with three characters, a man, a woman, and a lesbian woman, and they're basically in hell, and there's just three couches, I think, and they're just figuring out throughout that there is no fire and brimstone. The only torture is the other people. And Nietzsche's conveying a similar thing in that power is what motivates us to do things, even to gain new knowledge, which seems like it may be helping people. Nietzsche would say is simply a method of achieving greater power. And this is something Salta would use to basically say that we exercise power in the very fundamental nature of our being, in that we need to be recognized in order to be able to call ourselves a being. This is the famous Hegelian master-slave dialectic, in a sense, in which we seek mastery over another, which we treat as a slave, in the sense that they treat us as a conscious entity and treat us with an identity that we can reciprocate in ourselves and say, okay, yes, I have gained freedom and independence as a person. I am a unique thing. And you could read the master-slave dialectic, because of course Hegel takes it both ways. Hegel says one must be a master and a slave at the same time, and that both are integral to consciousness being able to have an identity. But Nietzsche takes that very one-sided approach that Salto would take in No Exit, where hell is other people, as one of the main characters says in No Exit. Nietzsche would say that these dynamics of social relations are always about power. Now, to take us to our last example, I think this is a very important aphorism. It's the very last aphorism of Human Altered Human, and it's titled The Wanderer. It's number 638. This is probably my favorite passage ever of Nietzsche, tied with the introduction to Thus Spoke Zarathustra. I think this wonderfully examines the existentialist mood of being solitary and loneliness and things like this. And it highlights in a very metaphorical manner Nietzsche's understanding of other people. We must keep in mind this famous line that hell is other people, that Salto would say, and see how maybe that might have been influenced by Nietzsche, and you'll see why in a moment. But not only does this acquire a better understanding of how we're supposed to go about knowledge, what it serves, but also where to go, and it highlights some of the specific moods of loneliness that may be felt by a wanderer. He who has come only in part to a freedom of reason cannot feel on earth otherwise than as a wanderer, though not as a traveler towards a final goal, for this does not exist. But he does not want to observe and keep his eyes open for everything that actually occurs in the world. Therefore, he must not attach his heart too firmly to any individual thing. There must be something wandering within him which takes its joy in change and transitoriness. To be sure, such a man will have bad nights, when he is tired, and finds closed the gates to the city that should offer him rest. Perhaps in addition, as in the Orient, the desert reaches up to the gate. Predatory animals howl, now near, now far. A strong wind stirs. Robbers lead off his pack animals. Then for him the frightful night sinks over the desert like a second desert, and his heart becomes tired of wandering. If the morning sun then rises, glowing like a divinity of wrath, and the city opens up, he sees in the faces of its inhabitants perhaps more of desert dirt, deception, uncertainty than outside the gates, and the day is almost worse than the night. So it may happen sometimes to the wanderer, but then as recompense come the ecstatic mornings of other regions and days. Then, nearby in the dawning light, he already sees the bands of muses dancing past him in the midst of the mountains. Afterwards, he strolls quietly in the equilibrium of his forenoon soul, under trees from whose tops and leafy corners only good and bright things are thrown down to him, the gifts of all those free spirits who are at home in mountain, wood, and solitude, and who are like him in their sometimes merry, sometimes contemplative way, wanderers and philosophers. Born out of the mysteries of the dawn, they ponder how the day can have such a pure, transparent, transfigured, and cheerful face between the hours of 10 and 12. They seek the philosophy of the forenoon. And I am particularly fond of this passage because he mentions going into the city after becoming disheartened by the desert of the night. This is kind of similar to the darkness in Plato's cave, in Plato's allegory of the cave, because of course Plato is talking about darkness as kind of not knowing the truth and light as knowing the truth, and how do we get out of the cave and stuff like this, and how do we get past just the mere appearance of things to how they actually are. And Nietzsche kind of cautions us against the very idea of other people, which you could take several different readings of this, saying that he literally just, doesn't want you to rely on other people, to the point where maybe he's simply saying that you need to be cautious around other people. You could read it multiple ways. But of course, he highlights this feeling of loneliness and uses the example of animals howling and pack animals, which of course, animals in philosophy is notorious. I think of the owl of Minerva that Hegel speaks of, and then there's also several other examples, for example, in the Republic by Plato. And I think this highlights very greatly the focus on the individual philosopher, not as someone who seeks knowledge, but as someone who seeks a living knowledge. And a living knowledge in the sense that it is constantly changing. It's the sort of Heraclitean flux that he speaks about when he speaks about fire, and this being so integral to things. I think Nietzsche makes an important criticism of this sort of sedentary knowledge that someone like Socrates may have come up with, where we're trying to reach a singular way of understanding. Nietzsche, whether he likes it or not, is here maybe a bit dialectical, maybe a bit Hegelian, in the sense that he wants this more broad conception of knowledge. And Nietzsche did not like Hegel. And of course, Hegel in his writings, even though Hegel's much before Nietzsche, Hegel kind of anticipates Nietzsche. So regardless of whether or not this actually happens, I think the argument could be made that Nietzsche is here becoming a little bit dialectical and a bit Hegelian, in the sense that he's not so satisfied with this singular knowledge. He's rather concerned with change and transitoriness, as he says, that the wanderer takes his joy in change and transitoriness. And I think this is the sort of philosophy of living, not in the sense of a self-help book, but in the sense in which philosophy is itself living. It's itself a dynamic entity that the existentialists would go on to really highlight in their works, kind of this bedrock of subjectivity and freedom and choice and action, and also this sort of change and transitoriness that Nietzsche is very keen upon. So I hope this lecture gives you a little bit of insight into Nietzsche as a philosopher. I think if you really want to get into what he has to say, I think Thus Spoke Zarathustra has, it's fine. In fact, uh, when I started reading philosophy, gosh, what is that? Boethius, The Consolation of Philosophy, was the first book I read when I was in probably 7th or 8th grade. And the second book I read, I think, was in 9th grade, and it was Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And I think that's just a terrible idea, first off. If you want to start with philosophy, do not start with Thus Spoke Zarathustra. By no means am I saying this is a difficult philosophy text. If you want a difficult philosophy text, read The Phenomenology of Spirit, or the Wissenschaft der Logik, or the Heidegger's Being in Time, or Blondel's Action 1893. Like, those are difficult books. Nietzsche is very eloquent, but he's equally as obscure, and you could probably get these insights in a more direct form from someone like Hume, who's a bit more clear with his language. And I don't necessarily mean that Nietzsche is ambiguous. I just mean that he's a philosopher that likes to live in the shadows and kind of make you do a lot of philosophizing. So I think The Gay Science is a good one to start with. It's very broad and it covers a lot of different topics. I think Human, All Too Human is probably, actually, I would say, the best with Nietzsche to start with. It's not as ambiguous in terms of using metaphor and things like this. He often makes very direct statements, but it also has a lot to munch on. So I would recommend starting with probably Human, All Too Human, maybe then The Gay Science, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. I would caution you against starting with Beyond Good and Evil. I think that's one of his more difficult texts. So with all this said, I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you've learned something about Nietzsche and have been invigorated to learn about him. He's probably one of my favorite philosophers, probably tied with, I don't know, Hegel and Schopenhauer. But I think he has a lot of insights that he makes in a very poignant way. I don't agree with everything he says, and I think most people wouldn't. But I hope that you dig into his philosophy, especially if you're religious, not in the sense of, trying to be a sort of deconversion. But he makes a lot of very important darts that can be very important for one's conception of knowledge more broadly, and how to live a life, not a good life like the Greeks might have envisioned, but simply a life that you enjoy.